Welcome to video 4 of 5 for section 4, chapter 1 in your trig book. This is going to demonstrate the problems that are essentially going to put together pretty much everything that we have done in this unit. We're going to do 2 examples here in this video, and then we will have one more video to wrap up chapter 1. So the problems that we're looking at say, suppose that angle theta is in quadrant 2, so they're telling us where it terminates, and the sine of theta is 2/3. Find the value of the other 5 trig functions. So you'll notice that I've provided you with a coordinate plane. This is because the easiest way to approach this problem is to draw a picture. How many times did your geometry and your pre-calc teacher tell you that? Draw a picture. It makes things much easier. So we know that angle theta is in quadrant 2. So we draw an angle that is terminating in quadrant 2. It does not matter where you put that point as long as it is in quadrant 2. Now keep in mind that all along throughout this chapter we've been using that point xy to create a right triangle. Now they've told us that the sine of theta is 2/3. And in this chapter we have learned that sine is y over r, which tells us that y is 2 and r is 3. Now we do have to be a little bit careful with those because if there's a sign to deal with, we have to remember things like r is always positive. So if that had been a negative value, then y would have had to have been negative. So let's put those labels on our picture here. We know that y equals 2 and we know that r equals 3. The one thing we don't know that we need to know is x. So how do you think we start? Well, we start the same way we did when we did these similar problems earlier in the chapter. We do the Pythagorean theorem to figure out the value of x, the thing that we don't know. So we plug in the y value, which is 2, so 2 squared, and the r value, which is 3 squared, and we solve for x. So we have x squared plus 4 equals 9. Subtract 4 from each side and give us x squared equals 5, which means x is the square root of 5. Now, we need to be careful here again because we are in quadrant 2. And in quadrant 2, x values are negative. So that is not root 5, it is negative root 5. And it has to be negative because we are in quadrant 2. So from there we are essentially doing, we already know sine, so we need to write out the other 6 trig functions, which are cosine, tangent, which is defined in our section as y over x, cosecant, which is r over y, secant, which is r over x, and cotangent, which is x over y. So we use our values from our picture, which says that x is negative root 5 and r is 3. There's nothing that needs to be done to make that an appropriate fraction, so that one's done. Tangent is y over x, that is 2 over the negative square root of 5. Remember that we've discussed that we're not allowed to leave the square root of 5 in that answer. So we need to multiply the bottom and the top by the square root of 5, which would give us negative 2 root 5 over 5. And that is an appropriate answer. Notice I wrote the negative in front. You can write it in front, you can leave it on the bottom, you can put it on the top, it doesn't matter. The big thing is that is a negative fraction. Cosecant is r over y, which would be 3 over 2, which requires no additional work. Secant of secant of theta is r over x, which would be 3 over negative root 5. Same deal as before, we need to rationalize that denominator, multiply the bottom and the top by the square root of 5, which will give us negative 3 root 5 over 5, which is an appropriate answer. And finally, cotangent, which would be x over y, which would be negative root 5 over 2. Again, that does not require any work because we're allowed to have square roots in the numerator. So there are the other 5 trig functions that we were asked to find, neatly labeled in our workspace. Let's do another one. All right. Suppose that angle theta is in quadrant 3 and the tangent of theta equals 8 over 5. Find the values of the other 5 trig functions. So again, we know that that picture is going to place us somewhere in quadrant 3. Doesn't matter where. The big thing is that you are in the correct quadrant. Now, tangent of theta, which is the first of the 6 trig values, we already know, is defined as being y over x, and that equals 8 over 5. Now you're going to want to jump in here and say, oh, that means y equals 8 and x equals 5. But you have to be careful. Remember what quadrant you are in. In quadrant 3, x and y are both negative. So what this tells us is that y is negative 8 and x is negative 5. Now you're going, well, where do these negatives come from? Well, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So the fact that this is a positive fraction just means x and y have the same signs. It doesn't mean x and y are both positive. So since they're both negative, we would still have a positive tangent value of 8 over 5. So let's label our picture. We have x equals negative 5, and we have y equals negative 8. Our first step then is to figure out our r value. So to do that, we are going to, and I'm not going to write it in there just yet, so I'm going to make it so I can definitely write the value in there. Okay, so r. We're going to do the Pythagorean theorem, x squared plus y squared equals r squared. And we have negative 5 squared plus negative 8 squared. And when you feed that to your calculator, you need to make sure you're putting parentheses around those negatives. Because if you don't, your calculator will lie to you. Calculator's only as smart as the person hitting the buttons, so don't be that guy. Negative 5 squared is positive 25. Negative 8 squared is positive 64. Add those together, we get 89 equals r squared. So r would be the positive square root of 89. Now how do I know that r is positive? R is always positive because r is a distance. It is not a location. So r is equal to the square root of 89, which does not reduce, and I do not want a decimal, ever. No teacher that teaches this level of math is going to want that number as a decimal. They're going to want it as a reduced radical. So we need to figure out the other 5 trig functions. They are sine theta, is y over r, cosine theta, which is x over r, cosecant of theta, which is r over y, secant of theta, which is r over x, and cotangent of theta, which is x over y. Again, all of these are definitions from earlier in the chapter, so hopefully you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so sine is y over r. That is negative 8 over the square root of 89. Again, we've discussed how we can't have a square root in the denominator, so we multiply the bottom and the top by the square root of 89. And that gives us negative 8 root 89 over 89, which does not reduce. That is our answer. X over r is negative 5 over the square root of 89. Same exact work. We need to multiply the bottom and the top, rationalize it, times the square root of 89. Excuse me. Okay, and that would be negative 5 root 89 over 89. Cosecant is r over y. That is the square root of 89 over negative 8. Don't technically have to do anything to that fraction, so let's just leave it. Secant is r over x, root 89 over negative 5. Don't need to do anything to that either. And finally, cotangent, x over y. Both of those values are negative. So that means that a negative divided by a negative is a positive 5/8. That does it for video 4. We have one more video in this section as we discuss the other identities that we have not discussed yet, the Pythagorean identities.